Hello and welcome to the Crime and Sacrifice Podcast. This is episode 1, Chip and Tomasz. Located along the shores of Lake Ontario and bordered on the west by Irondequoit Bay, Webster is a scenic suburb of the city of Rochester, New York. With little crime, easy access to beautiful parks and waterways, and a well-respected school district, Webster has earned its reputation as a good place to live and raise a family. Tomasz Koziuka grew up in this idyllic neighborhood. A first-generation Polish-American, he attended Webster Thomas High School with his twin brothers and made the most of his time there. Known for a contagious smile and a penchant for practical jokes, Tomasz made friends easily. And at a time when most kids are just figuring out what they want from life, Tomasz was already pretty sure. He wanted his work to be in the service of others. At only 14 years old, he enrolled in the West Webster Volunteer Fire Department Explorer program, which allows high school students to obtain EMS and fire safety training. During the course of this program, explorers take part in fire training drills and are sometimes even allowed to respond to actual calls to observe how more experienced firefighters work, and to offer help in support roles. One of the more experienced firefighters that Tomasz was able to train with was Michael Ciparini, though a lot of friends just called him Chip. Chip had been a volunteer firefighter for over 20 years and was one of the most qualified people to train the young explorers, having served in virtually every post in the department at one time or another. Chip became a kind of mentor to Tomasz. In addition to his decades volunteering as a fireman, Chip was also an active police officer at the Webster Police Department, working his way up the ranks from dispatch to officer, investigator to sergeant, and ultimately serving as a lieutenant with the department. He was also a family man and loved spending time with his 2 young daughters, his wife, and an older son named Nick, who became a volunteer firefighter too. Chip was a police officer that cared. People would say how he knew the names of the kids in the neighborhood, how he would offer to drive people home if they were out walking in the cold, would stop at a local store that had a woman working alone at the counter just to make sure she felt safe. The same year that he graduated high school, in 2011, Tomasz became a full-fledged member of the West Webster Volunteer Fire Department. He was the youngest in the department at the time. He was also continuing his education at MCC, or Monroe Community College, with a concentration in fire safety, and began working as a 911 dispatcher for Monroe County. Despite such a busy year after high school, Tomasz made the dean's list in the fall of 2012. He was preparing to take his professional firefighter exams as the end of 2012 approached. Around the same time, mid-December of 2012, his friend and mentor Chip was awarded the well-deserved honor of Firefighter of the Year, and with 2013 around the corner, the future seemed to hold a lot of promise for them both. The holidays are a big deal in Webster, with last-minute shopping, elaborate light displays, and a feeling of festivity ramping up as the Christmas season approaches. 2012 was no exception, and many houses in the neighborhood were decked out in intricate holiday displays that glittered in the Rochester gloom. For the overnight shift going into Christmas Eve, Tomasz volunteered to be on call so that other firefighters could spend the morning with their families. Chip was also on call that night, along with fellow firefighters Ted Scardino and Joe Hofstetter, and the night passed without incident. But as dawn approached, a call came in about a burning vehicle and home on Lake Road. The call directed the team to a section of the road that was located right along the shore of Lake Ontario, a small strip of land that consisted mainly of tightly compacted homes and vacation properties. As they had so many times in the past, the team at the West Webster Volunteer Fire Department heeded that call Joe Hofstetter was a 14-year veteran of the department, and he responded to the scene first at around 5:30 a.m. He lived just down the street and took his own vehicle to the scene. He figured he'd be back home in an hour. A few moments later, Ted Scardino and Mike Ciparini arrived in a pumper truck, along with Tomasz Koziuka, who arrived in a department SUV. With the crew assembled, they began to exit their vehicles to assess the scene. Scardino exited the pumper with his air pack on and immediately heard 3 quick pops that he thought might be the tires or shocks of the burning car. But Mike Ciparini, with his years of training in law enforcement, knew better. Almost as soon as the first pop rang out, Chip yelled to the team that they were being shot at and directed everybody to take cover. As gunfire rained down on them from a high-powered automatic weapon, the windshield of the pumper truck shattered. Chip leapt out of the passenger side door to run with Ted toward the back of the truck in an effort to get out of the shooter's line of sight. Ted could hear as bullets ricocheted off the pumper and felt a searing pain as a bullet ripped through his upper back. He threw himself to the ground and crawled underneath the truck. He then made the devastating realization that Chip had not made it to the back of the truck with him. Mike had been shot and lay fatally wounded in the open street as the rest of the disoriented fire team struggled to find cover. They may not have known it at the time, but in 1980, 32 years before these events, at the very same location on Lake Road, police found themselves responding to a very different call. A 92-year-old woman named Rose Spengler had been found dead at the bottom of her own basement staircase, discovered by her then 30-year-old grandson, William. William lived just next door with his mother, Arlene, and reported the death to her before they contacted authorities. Police were immediately suspicious, as the injuries to Rose's head seemed inconsistent with a fall. Upon questioning William, they soon discovered the awful truth: that William had bludgeoned his own grandmother to death with a hammer before staging her body to look like she had fallen down the stairs. When asked why he committed such a horrific act, William would only say that they had gotten into an argument. The DA soon charged William with Rose's murder, and prosecutors began to get ready for a trial in July of 1981. However, in what William claimed was an effort to spare his family further distress with a prolonged court case, he pled guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter. The judge sentenced him to an indeterminate prison term for the crime. As years passed, William found himself facing the parole board time and time again, and at each hearing, he was denied. Something was unnerving about his demeanor, his apparent lack of remorse, and the parole board felt that it couldn't release him to the community in good conscience. When asked by the board commissioner in 1988 why he had killed his grandmother, Spengler still couldn't explain it. He said, "I still haven't figured that out. It was a matter of just wanting to get out. She was between me and the door." When a board member mentioned that she was just a fragile old lady, Spengler simply acknowledged that this was true, and stated again that he couldn't explain it. In 1993, the commissioner told William, "We maintain a belief that paroling you to the community poses a threat. So vicious and violent was this attack that we are concerned about your potential for volatility under stress." Parole was again denied. In 1995, Spengler said the following: "The last board, they said I might be a danger to the community. I can't figure out where in my record it shows that." Commissioner: "You killed a 92-year-old woman. We are worried that there might be another occasion where you lose your temper and you might repeat that behavior. That is what frightens us." Spengler's parole was denied once more, with the board stating, "Subject remains without insight and release at this time would be inappropriate. Spengler kept mainly to himself in prison, incurring no infractions or violations of prison rules through the years. For good behavior, he was even allowed to take part in a work crew that left the prison grounds to restore an old chapel. All of this was taken into consideration when his 1998 parole hearing came around. This time, Spengler did try to offer some justification for his crime, saying that, on the day of the killing, he had planned to nail the basement door shut to prevent his grandmother from going down the stairs and hurting herself. He claimed that his grandmother had been known for her difficult personality and a tendency toward violence. He stated that she became angry and that she attacked him first, kneeing him in the groin. He never did admit to hitting her all 13 times. But this attempt to understand his crime, his spotless prison record, plus his quiet and articulate demeanor, all helped to nudge the parole board to finally release Spengler after having spent close to 18 years in prison. He remained on probation from his 1998 release until 2006. William settled into a quiet life outside of prison, moving back in with his mother Arlene and his older sister Cheryl, and occasionally finding work as a house painter. He kept to himself and stayed out of trouble, though neighbors reported that he seemed socially awkward and kind of rough from the years he spent in prison. What nobody could know at the time was that whatever rage had driven William to murder his grandmother was still there, laying dormant until some awful catalyst would lay it bare again. Neighbors in the tight-knit lakefront community reported that all of the Spenglers tended to keep to themselves. But some of them did notice an animosity between the siblings, Cheryl and William. They would see William out there snowblowing the family driveway, making sure that every car had an easy path out, except for his sister's Jeep. They would also see William go to get the mail and purposely sift out and return his sister's letters to the box, so that she would have to go out and get them herself. A relative who wasn't particularly close to them also mentioned that William and Cheryl had fierce arguments over who would inherit the family home, and that they even lived on totally separate sides of the house. As the years passed, Arlene's health began to decline as she entered her 90s. She was eventually too ill to stay at home and began life at a nearby nursing home. William's devotion to her was apparent, and he would visit her every day. Then, in October of 2012, the inevitable happened, and Arlene passed away. Both Spengler children were present when first making arrangements for her funeral, but soon William took off, seeming unable to handle the discussions, and leaving Cheryl to finalize everything on her own. She asked contributions be made in memory of her mother to the ambulance fund of the Webster Volunteer Firemen's Association, since they had helped her mother greatly as her health declined. Cheryl had wanted to thank them. Cheryl was also a quiet person that tended to keep to herself, though she did have some friends that she remained close to throughout the years. One of these was former coworker Teresa Sikat, who worked with Cheryl in the 1960s. When going through a divorce, Teresa was thankful for Cheryl's friendship, who would visit every Friday and would often go out to dinner with Teresa, always sure to include her sons. Other coworkers also noted that Cheryl was very private. But unlike William, she definitely wasn't an outcast. At work, she was friendly with her coworkers. She also liked to dress in a manner that was reminiscent of the 1950s, with one coworker reporting that she reminded him of a character straight out of Mad Men. After their mother's death in fall of 2012, Cheryl began growing unnerved by the erratic behavior of her brother, and there was a growing friction between them about the home they shared. Cheryl had contacted a lawyer, and she recently purchased a home in nearby Henrietta that she planned to move into as soon as the holiday season was over, hoping for a fresh start. But as the events of Christmas Eve 2012 played out, and news of the incident spread on local media. Cheryl's friend, Teresa Sakat, became increasingly concerned, a sinking feeling growing as she called over and over to make sure that her friend was okay. Cheryl did not pick up. Joe Hofstetter, the volunteer firefighter who had arrived first in his own car, heard Chip's warning just as he felt a bullet rip into his lower body as he fell. Realizing that the pumper truck was offering some cover between him and the shooter, Joe crawled to the driver's side doorway. As he looked around, he saw that Tomasz Kajuka had not made it to cover and lay bleeding in the open street, not moving. Police would later determine that he was killed very soon after the gunshots first rang out, 2 bullets striking him that proved fatal. Joe could see that Chip had also been shot and lay in the street on the other side of the truck. He couldn't see Ted, but he knew their only chance of survival was for backup to arrive. Reaching for the radio, he made a crucial call to the fire dispatcher to let them know his situation, speaking with a calmness that is remarkable.
125 to dispatcher. 125. We are being shot at. Multiple firemen down. Multiple firemen shot. I am shot. I think we have an assault rifle. We have multiple firemen down. Working fire. Multiple fire shot with a firearm.
As Joe was making that call, Ted remained hidden under the back of the truck, thoughts racing through his head. He hoped that it would just be minutes before police arrived, and figured his best bet would be to lay motionless, to play dead, and to stay out of sight. But his mind kept wandering to a place of fear, at never seeing his family again. After about 5 minutes, a second bullet hit him in the right knee, and he braced himself for more that didn't come. He then saw bottles of gas being flung toward the fire truck as the shooter seemed to be attempting to ignite the entire truck by shooting at the gasoline pooling on the ground. Another bullet ricocheted up and hit Ted, but fortunately, the gas did not ignite. But then Ted heard the truck go into gear. Standing at the edge of the driver's side door, Joe Hofstetter thought that using the fire truck as cover might be his best bet. He stood halfway out of the cab with his good leg, trying to use his hands to both push the gas and steer the wheel, in an effort to stay low and out of sight from the shooter. The truck rolled into motion and began pulling away, a hail of gunfire raining down, striking it at least 38 more times. But Joe only made it about 150 feet before crashing into something, as he desperately tried to formulate another plan. But of course, Joe hadn't realized that Ted had been hiding under the truck, using it as cover. He was now laying in the open street, completely exposed. He braced himself and tried not to move. It was just around this time that an off-duty police officer, John Ritter, came upon the scene. He was on his way to work, which took him down Lake Road toward the nearby town of Greece, a trip he had taken countless days before. He didn't have a police scanner in his car and had no weapon. As Officer Ritter later described to media outlets, as he came around the corner, he saw the fire truck moving to the left. It was then that he heard a popping sound that he recognized as gunfire and could see the muzzle flashes of a high-powered rifle. His approach seems to have surprised the shooter, who turned his attention to the oncoming car and began firing. Officer Ritter's windshield exploded from the bullets as glass and shrapnel pounded into his chest and cut up his left arm. He then ducked out of sight and slammed his car into reverse, driving blindly in the direction he hoped was out of the shooter's line of sight. He called in the attack, having seen that there were firemen laying open in the street. As all of this was going on, the fire had continued to grow, spreading from the initial car and home to adjacent buildings in this tightly built section of Lake Road. Police had been speeding to the scene, and finally, they arrived. The first armed police officers on scene could see that the shooter had set himself up in a natural hollow above the fire truck. It seemed possible that this had all been staged, a trap meant to take the lives of those who risk everything for their communities. Police began to fire on this position, and the suspect exchanged gunfire with them briefly. Though at this time, police were still trying to determine how many shooters there were, and were attempting to set up some kind of perimeter. With the shooter still at large, police advised local residents to stay in their homes and shelter in place. But this was becoming impossible to some as the fire and heat spread. Many terrified residents were forced to flee, and several people could be seen running from their homes as police met them, patted them down, and escorted them to safety. Meanwhile, armored personnel carriers were en route to help transport civilians as police tried to pin down the location of their shooter, and as flames whipped wildly into the sky. No more gunfire was exchanged, though several times police saw the person they believed to be the shooter, ducking behind trees and other forms of cover. Joe Hofstetter was heartened by the sight of police arriving on scene. He took the opportunity and made his way to his own vehicle. He was able to drive clear of the scene and into the waiting arms of police and emergency personnel. But Ted Scardino was still alive and pinned down in the open, laying in the street not far from his fallen brothers. He recognized that police had arrived on scene and were drawing the attention of the shooter. This allowed him to risk movement, and he began communicating with dispatch via his radio. As the fire raged beside him and blood poured out of his gunshot wounds, he asked for his next of kin to be notified, not sure that he would make it out alive, waiting in the cold for what felt like a lifetime. His body grew alternately freezing in the December air and scorched by the nearby blaze whenever the wind changed, causing him to suffer second-degree burns. He felt a strange sensation of being alone in the chaos as the fire blocked out many other sounds. Finally, SWAT teams arrived on scene. At 7:15 a.m., 90 minutes after he had first been struck by a bullet, Ted Scardino was extracted from the scene, an ambulance soon speeding him to the hospital as he made a phone call to his wife. A nearby resident reported that his son had woken him up to say that there was a fire down the strip. SWAT teams were moving door to door, evacuating those residents who hadn't fled. When they looked out the window, they saw the fire burning and were soon escorted to an armored vehicle. They sat alongside other residents who watched as their homes burned to the ground. In total, 33 civilians were evacuated. The heavily armored SWAT teams looked like commandos in a war zone, something very surreal in this otherwise safe town. As police teams gathered and closed in, the shooter fled on foot toward the beach. He had never intended to face the consequences of his actions, or to look in the eyes of those families he had devastated. And so, with his final cowardly act, William Spengler, now a 62-year-old shell of a man, pressed a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, dying instantly. Around 11 a.m., police found his body laying alone along the beach. With Spengler confirmed dead, other area fire crews were finally allowed on scene to begin fighting the blaze, which had since spread to several other homes and properties. From a distance, it was difficult to see anything but the orange halo of fire and the thick black smoke that billowed from the burning properties. When the firefighters' work was over, most of the homes were little more than smoldering foundations. They began the grim task of searching for other bodies. Besides the two slain firemen, Chip and Tomasz, police found just one body, charred beyond recognition. It was inside the Spengler household, still laying in what would have been a bed. Police thought that this must be Cheryl Spengler. It was her 2010 Ford Explorer that had been burning in the driveway. tagged with her novelty license plate moniker of Cher. It took months, but DNA eventually confirmed that it was indeed the body of Cheryl. Metal fragments were found in her skull, and it was determined that William had likely shot her in the head while she slept, with the very same handgun he would eventually turn on himself. While surveying the scene, police also found a 2.5-page typewritten letter, protected in plastic, and hanging from a chain-link fence behind the Spengler household. It was written by the killer. But the 1,400-word letter wasn't a suicide note, and it didn't offer any sort of motive for the crime. Instead, it rambled on and on about a woman named Dawn Welsher, a former neighbor and former friend. And it was just a delusional list of grievances against her. The letter may be significant in that it reflects William's mind at the time, twisted by rage and rambling with imagined slights and self-pity. And toward its conclusion, Spengler did make mention of his intent to ambush and murder first responders. The last sentence was probably the most chilling of all. Now, if you'll excuse me, all this typing really aggravated the arthritis in my hands, and I still have to get ready to see how much of the neighborhood I can burn down, and do what I like doing best: killing people. The letter has never been released in its entirety to the public, though it did inform investigators as to where Spengler, a convicted felon, had acquired such an arsenal of guns. The letter implicated Dawn Welsher's daughter, Dawn Huen, claiming that she had bought the guns for William at a local Gander Mountain sporting goods store. But before further investigation could take place, the community needed time to heal. The incident was a nightmare for the families of the firefighters that survived. But for the families of Mike Ciparini, who was 43 when he died, and Tomasz Koziuka, only 19 years old, one can't even imagine the suffering. Chip left behind a wife, 3 children, and countless friends and family members. His wife, Kim, mourned the loss of her best friend, the love of her life, and was faced with the prospect of raising their 3- and 4-year-old girls alone. Chip's son, Nick, was older, a young man who had admired his father so much that he wanted to work alongside him and followed in his footsteps to become a volunteer firefighter with the Webster Department. During this time, he had also become great friends with Tomasz. Nick was on duty at dispatch for the Monroe Ambulance Company when the call came in that day, and had to listen in agony as the events unfolded. Tomasz never had the chance to get married and start a family. At only 19 years old, he couldn't even buy a beer. His family will always feel his loss. News of the tragedy, the horrible shock of realizing that the killer had laid in wait to attack first responders. Something about it resonated, and the incident soon became national news. It was only a couple of weeks after the tragedy at Sandy Hook, and it was revealed that William Spengler carried the same kind of rifle as the murderer there. There was the usual rhetoric on the national scene, with pundits and commentators on both sides of the debate trying to use this incident to rally people to their cause. But in Rochester, there was a strong desire to pull together, despite differences, that prevailed. Several thousand people, including many police officers and firefighters from around the country, came to the Webster area to attend the funerals. And while visiting, many servicemen and women encountered acts of kindness from the residents, with restaurant tabs and hotel rooms that were picked up by strangers seeking to acknowledge their service to us all. William might have hoped that he could cause chaos or discord or hopelessness within this community, but he failed. The day after the incident, Christmas Day, some residents were allowed to return to begin collecting what belongings they could. In total, 7 homes were completely destroyed, and another was rendered unlivable. West Webster volunteer firefighter Joseph Hofstetter, who managed to escape in his own vehicle, ended up spending 13 days in the hospital and undergoing 9 months of physical therapy. He still has bullet fragments lodged in his body, but is active as a full-time firefighter with the City of Rochester Department. Ted Scardino, who was stranded with bullet wounds in the street for 90 minutes, spent 8 days in intensive care. Besides his 3 broken ribs, a broken shoulder blade, and an injury to a bundle of nerves, doctors had the difficult task of trying to reinflate a collapsed lung. They succeeded, though after his release from the hospital, Ted had to attend physical therapy 5 days a week for years afterward. He is still an active member of the West Webster Volunteer Fire Department. Cheryl's remains were identified with time, and she was laid to rest. She was the first victim of her brother on that tragic Christmas Eve. Her death, a terrible echo of the violence William had wrought on his own family before, decades earlier. Teresa Sakat lost her best friend that day. Shirley Ashwood, a cousin of Cheryl and William, made a statement to news outlets saying that she and much of her family had been distant from William ever since the murder of his grandmother Rose. Shirley grieved for Cheryl and for the lives of the firefighters lost. And as the community began to rebuild, many wanted answers as to how a violent felon such as William Spengler had been able to obtain firearms of any kind, much less a high-powered rifle. Investigators soon confirmed that it was indeed Dawn Huen who had purchased the weapons for him, though it's doubtful that she had any idea of the implications of her actions. She had bought them in 2010, close to 900 days before the incident took place. Authorities were able to track the purchase to a local Gander Mountain, just as Spengler had said. Many believed that Dawn should pay for her role in making this tragedy possible, and that the store should be held accountable for its irresponsible sale. Dawn had been accompanied by William the day she was purchasing the weapons, and some claimed that store clerks should have been able to recognize that the guns were actually intended for William. The guns were paid for in cash, and Dawn received an additional $1,000 from William for her trouble. Dawn was ultimately convicted in New York State of lying on the firearms transaction form and was sentenced to 16 months to 4 years in prison, an outcome that injured firefighter Ted Scardino praised. Months later, she pled guilty to 3 related federal charges and was sentenced to 8 additional years in federal prison to run concurrently with her state conviction. She has since served her state sentence and is still serving time in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. Dawn is scheduled to be released in July of 2021. Gander Mountain filed for bankruptcy to avoid being sued. The chain eventually reopened with a new name and owner. Many affected by this tragedy did their best to make something positive come of it, with many going before the state Senate to petition for special treatment in cases where shooters target first responders. The New York State Senate subsequently included a Webster provision in a larger gun control law. This provision mandates life in prison without the possibility of parole for any person that murders first responders. To this day, every holiday season, people still gather to remember the tragic events that took place. In 2013, such a large crowd gathered that Lake Road had to be closed to traffic. Today, the remembrance tends to draw a more modest crowd of between 40 and 50 people, many of those whose lives have been forever altered by the cowardice of one and the heroism of others, those who died or were injured in the line of duty as firefighters, dedicated to saving lives, and those who intervened to prevent even more lives from being lost that day. Many of the Lake Road homes that burned down have been rebuilt, though at least one plot has remained empty, where the Spengler household stood. Across the street, there is a memorial honoring the sacrifice of Michael Ciparini and Tomasz Kajuka. And in Webster, life goes on, though with an added heaviness every holiday season for those that remember the events of Christmas Eve 2012. That's it for the very first episode of the Crime and Sacrifice podcast. I'm not really sure if I'll be sharing my thoughts or reasoning for choosing certain cases moving forward, because normally I think there's a value in simply presenting what happened, to let each listener come to his or her own conclusions. But there are several reasons why I chose this case first, and maybe there's value in hearing that too. Feel free to skip it if you want, and know that whenever I do get into my own reasoning or thoughts for choosing a case, I'll try to save it for the end of the episode. I grew up in Rochester with many family members working in law enforcement. One of the great sadnesses of my early life, something I didn't understand until much later on, was when an aunt of mine passed away after a prolonged illness, the result of an injury and assault she had sustained while on duty as a corporal in the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. I remember feeling a helplessness as my cousin cried and hugged me, the ways that our family inevitably changed, and the ripples that will last throughout decades and generations. I wish today that I had known her better, and that I could have met her as an adult. I also know that my family losing her shaped me in some way, even if I'm not exactly sure how. Christmas Eve of 2012, I was still living in Rochester and working at a local TV station. I remember the horror of realizing that somebody had purposely targeted firefighters, those who risk their lives to save others, and how this case impacted and shocked the entire city. I'm also close to someone who was deeply affected by this tragedy, a 41-year veteran of the West Webster Fire Department who had to say goodbye to his brothers far before their time. And I guess this is just one of those cases that has always stayed with me, that I've wanted to research and try to understand. So I guess starting this podcast was my chance. I also wanted to cover this case because it reminds me of how important it is to understand the impact of something like this, that every true crime story represents real people, the pain of entire families and often whole communities. I don't ever want to forget that, and with this one, I guess I couldn't because I felt some of that pain at the time. One of the unexpected gifts I received was getting to know Michael Ciparini and Tomasz Kajuka in some very small way. Hearing about their personalities, their humor, how they impacted the people in their lives, and their dedication to saving people, it inspires me, and it makes me want to be better. Joe Hofstetter and Ted Scardino, too. Their courage and the fact that they're still out there, still working as firemen and saving lives today. And I guess this case perfectly encapsulates the purpose of this show, to demonstrate the best and the worst of humanity. And I'm grateful to be able to share the stories of these firefighters and the sacrifice they made. And as I get ready to launch this episode in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm thankful for all of the people who are out there working every day to protect human life. The first responders, firefighters, police officers, healthcare providers, and others. You represent the best of us. Also, I guess I should say some basic admin stuff. So if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and leaving a review. It really helps us out. You can find the show notes for this and future episodes on our website at crimeandsacrifice.com, where you'll be able to see all of the resources used and also some photos, this week of Chip and Tomasz. You can also connect with me on social media and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe and be kind to each other. What kind of person will you choose to be?